some films, television shows, comic books, and novels tend to disappear in the background of time moving forward. There are things that we all miss, maybe things that some of us have heard about, but never investigated. There's too much media between streaming apps, video games, comics, books, radio shows, podcasts, music. No one has time to catch everything. But at Dying of Exposure, we feel like there's a few things you should pay attention to. So we started the series Hidden Gems. I'm sitting with Jess Hart. My name is Steve. And let's get into the first episode of Hidden Gems, Enemy Mine.
Enemy Mine is a 1985 science fiction film starring Dennis Quaid and Louis Gossett Jr. A number of you have probably seen it. Many of you have probably never heard of it. You have no idea what it is that I'm talking about. The basic premise of the film is based upon a novella by Barry B. Longyear, a Hugo and Nebula award-winning story about a war between humanity and a species known as the Drak, both of whom are interstellar colonizers and warriors. And two pilots, Willis Davidge and Jariba, are stranded together on a hostile planet with only each other to cling to for survival. They have to learn how to work together in order to live on this planet.
Now, what I like about this film, and it came out in 1985, toward the end of the Cold War, and in my mind, it's weirdly and uniquely always attached to The Last Starfighter, even though that's a much worse movie than this.
Absolutely.
Enemy Mine is...
In fact, the two films are often bundled together in DVD sales sets.
Yeah. For those Gen Z listeners and viewers, DVDs were these physical discs that you got to watch movies and television on that you used to either go to rent at ancient and now decrepit businesses like Hollywood and Blockbuster Video, or purchase at ancient and decrepit businesses like Circuit City and Best Buy. What I like about Enemy Mine is that I don't know when the book was published, or the novella was published, but I do know that the movie came out in what seemed to be the right time.
Well, it's the novella was published in 1979.
Okay, so it's close. And so it feels like a story very much of the time, as sci-fi so often is. We were well past the Stalin era of the USSR, a decade and a half, I guess, when the novella was released, past the Cuban Missile Crisis.
But not quite at the age of Glasnost.
Yeah, and so it was this kind of understanding that the Red Scare that a generation of baby boomers had grown up with wasn't necessarily the unified, villainous, inhuman communism basalt monolith that it had been presented as. So you have that classic "my enemy is also a human" tone applied very much to two large powers that tend to colonize the space that they have and vie for control work. And so it's no surprise this got adapted into a film when it did. And so I always kind of picture it. It's definitely a movie from my and your childhood as we ride both sides of the cusp of Gen X and millennials. But I've always felt like it was a very timeless story and at the same time a perfectly timed story for when it came out.
I absolutely agree with that. And what's especially interesting about it is that the film itself shares a lot of similarities with another film, which is the 1968 World War II film Hell in the Pacific, starring Lee Marvin, who people might know from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance or The Dirty Dozen, and Toshiro Mifune, who people probably know best from his work with Akira Kurosawa on films like Seven Samurai, Throne of Blood, Rashomon, and Yojimbo. And that story was about an American and Japanese soldier trapped together on an island in the Pacific, going through much of the same struggle, not sharing a common language, ideology, or goal, and finding that they had to work together in order to survive. And yet, at the same time, while it shares so much in common with that film, it is itself its own beast in that Barry B. Longyear's story, as I said, Hugo and Nebula award winning, and those are no small awards. The story has a core of universality to it. The idea of understanding and befriending your own enemy, finding the humanity in the alien. The film, as I said, stars Dennis Quaid as a human pilot, Willis Davidge, and Louis Gossett Jr. as the Drac pilot, Jariba. And they are as different from one another as it's possible to be while both being soldiers, which is pretty cool. The Drac are an androgynous race that reproduces asexually and is an older colonizing force in the galaxy than humanity, and they view humanity as the up-jumped, scrappy young Turks trying to take over their territory, whereas humanity views them as sort of dark overlords who are preventing the expansion of Earth into the galaxy. As they start off, they're in a space dogfight, and it's as classically a 1980s space dogfight as you can see.
Yeah.
And they end up getting shot down by one another on this planet that is just as hostile as it could possibly be, while still having a breathable atmosphere for both species. Dennis Quaid, our point of view character, is Davidge. Once he crashes and finds that his wingman is dead, all he wants to do is seek out the Drac pilot he downed to kill him.
Yep.
He's just like, look, I'm not getting out of here, but I'm gonna take this guy with me. And as it turns out, the planet itself is so hostile to their existence that they can't go through with killing one another because they find that they have to cling to each other for survival.
All right. So this is about where I want to nix out any more specifics about how the plot evolves from here, because it gives you the setup and the premise of the movie.
Sure. Then we're talking the first 15 minutes.
Yeah, we're talking the first 15 minutes. We're not here to break down and give you a whole of a movie. We want you to go watch this movie after hearing this and be like, oh, I should get into it, or rewatch it if you remember it as a child but haven't seen it recently, or go read the novella, which would also be acceptable if you enjoy printed word. I would like to talk first about why this movie works in the broadest sense. And you've already brought up sort of the fact that it is absolutely consistent with previous films. It is something that humanity has always played with in its fiction with its wars, humanizing the enemy. But I think one of the big things about Enemy Mine, if you were to go to the IMDb for this film, or if you recall the cast specifically, you realize this is a pretty intimate film. There's not really a lot of characters in it that make the difference for most of the screen time, and that's by design of the story, this is by design of the film. It does something that science fiction does extremely well and usually is improved by keeping the stories intimate and specific and narrower, while letting the themes of the stories be the bigger pieces. If Enemy Mine had been another 80s movie with a bunch of aliens and a bunch of science fiction effects that were hyping Star Wars a handful of years later, or putting in that early CG, there's a good chance it would have been like Last Starfighter, cheesy, hokey. By keeping it intimate, by keeping it not so much claustrophobic as narrow in the scope of what you get to see and interact with and who you're watching, you can really let the plot and the acting breathe, and let the sci-fi elements humanize and connect themselves to you as an audience member in a way that so many good science fiction movies do. And it really is why, even though this wasn't the biggest budget film of the 80s, it manages to hold through the dated effects and through some of the dated scenes and material to still be watchable and enjoyable and relevant today.
Well, not only that, but the practical effects that are used, especially in terms of the makeup that they give to Louis Gossett Jr. as a Drac, are so believable and physically palpable. You look at him and he has a mastery of body language that makes him a brilliantly alien character. And we're talking full head makeup, not just face makeup, but a full head makeup for a reptilian visage, including contacts that give him alien eyes, a strange speech pattern, a highly detailed alien language for the Drac language. And not only that, but a major source of the plot for the film is in Drac philosophy, the Talmud, and in the teachings of Shizma, their holy figure. They have done the work in the film of, through a single character, realizing the alienness of the Drac, and yet finding the humanity in them to see the universality of truths. When Jariba teaches Davidge from the Talmud, Davidge is very quick to state that a lot of these are universal philosophical truths that he knows from the Bible or the I Ching, and points out that humanity also has these teachings, and they both, because they're stuck in this hellish situation, get to realize that the better natures of their civilizations are at their core the same. War makes enemies of all of us, and it ruins that commonality.
You bring up the makeup, and so it's a good segue for some of the background production of this. Now, you bring up how good Lou Gossett's outfit is, and how good his makeup is, but that wasn't always so. So the reason Enemy Mine is probably a hidden gem and not just one of the big blockbusters of the 80s that worked is because it didn't work in the movie theaters. It spent about $40 million between production and marketing, have a $12 million run in the theaters. That's a big hit. Now, if you go over to Wikipedia, you'll find out later this movie was popular in Russia after Glasnost, after it was one of the first available science fiction blockbusters in Russia, and it makes a lot of sense too. The themes are there.
Yeah, absolutely.
The themes are there, as I discussed. But what's impressive is this actually had a different director to start with, Richard Longcrane. Richard Longcrane had this movie to begin with, and it was being filmed in Iceland and Budapest to try and have alien environments that were like natural looking, and Lou Gossett Jr.'s costume looked cheap, and the set still looked like Earth, and so it wasn't working. And so after 3 weeks of filming, he was ousted. It was not going to adapt well, and there was a big problem. But Fox was determined to get this property going, so they wanted that big science fiction blockbuster, and they wanted it to be different than what was happening in the 80s. So they got Wolfgang Petersen.
Right, they bring in a heavy hitter, precisely, and of course, you know, in looking at that, it's you know, Richard Longcrane, not himself a heavy hitter. He was coming off the success of The Missionary, and The Missionary wasn't a huge hit so much as it was critically acclaimed and had this great look to it. That felt real and visceral in a way that a lot of the period pieces of the time did not. But he was obviously not sustaining that through early productions, and that ultimately tells in what his career ended up being. He was not someone who had staying power in Hollywood.
Yeah, versus Wolfgang Petersen, and they actually had to wait for him to finish directing The Neverending Story for him to join this project. And if any of you are familiar with Neverending Story, you begin to understand why it's like, this is the director we need to make this science fiction, make this alien looking while still keeping the humanity of it.
Right, his production team is absolutely responsible for immersive environments and costuming that really bring you into the story. And so this was a guy where they were like, look, we have this award-winning story that we've scripted up. We need somebody to realize.
So, regardless of how much they spent with Long Crane, they gave Wolfgang Petersen a $24 million budget to get it done. And he puts together a movie that just feels very consistent with the novel. It feels like exactly the sort of respect that award-winning story should have gotten. And he releases it, unfortunately, to an unwilling to watch it audience over the holiday season, which was a mistake in release schedule. This is a very warm movie, but it's a very thinking warm movie. And putting that over the holiday season when it was not a fun, action-y sci-fi film, and it was not something that children would be that interested in initially. Most children, when it doesn't have a lot of spectacle, especially very young children, there's a lot of talking. There's a lot of long scenes. There's a lot of acting through the makeup of Lou Gossett Jr. and real decent acting from Dennis Quaid.
And moreover, it's important to note, I know we're not going to get heavily into the plot, but there is a switch later on in the film in which we have a character introduced in Zamis who is a Drac child. And suddenly the film changes in tone, not entirely in plot and in concept and theme, but the tone of the film changes significantly. The audience has to be on board for that and you have to have earned that switch in tone. And while that's fantastic and it works great in the film, again, it just makes the film that much harder to market.
Yeah. So, oh, by the way, a little bit of trivia on this. Zamis, the Drac child, Bumper Robinson. Speaking of hidden gems, everybody, if you see this picture of Bumper Robinson, you will know who he is. He was all over the place in the 80s and 90s on television. And if you hear his voice and play video games or watch cartoons on television, you will also know who he is. Bumper Robinson is a prolific voice actor and was a pretty prolific guest actor on tons of TV
right,
shows.
He is one of those immediately recognizable celebrities where you're like, I saw him in everything. And then you find out that he has this massive work where he was the voice of Bumblebee in one of the Transformers series.
Yep.
And he's done voiceover work not just for animated films, but in video games and everything. He's one of those guys where you know his work, even if you don't know his name. As I put down, it's one of those guys who deserves to be famous.
Yeah, and so it's kind of amazing because you have Dennis Quaid, who's pretty famous. You have Lou Gossett Jr., who was very famous. You have a kid that's at the beginnings of his career that's going to become famous. And
he's fantastic in this film, by the way.
Yeah.
And then later on, you get like a quintessential 80s villain in Brian James, who anyone who looked at a picture of Brian James, and that's Brion James, if you saw him, you'd be like, he was the bad guy in like every 80s movie, in like Tango and Cash, for God's sake, Steel Dawn, DOA, The Wrong Guys, Red Heat. He's been the bad guy in so many films, and he just has that look. It's like, that's the kind of cast that you have for this, and it's such a small, intimate cast that everybody gets their opportunity to shine.
Or when you recognize that this movie failed in the box office, found life on VHS afterward, found life in international release afterward, found life in syndicated television afterward, you realize that there might be an entire category of people, because if you weren't a kid, especially if you're younger, if you weren't a kid in the 90s when this was airing on television sometimes, or on HBO or Showtime or the Movie Channel, back in the 90s, if you had premium cable, or you weren't exposed to specific levels of science fiction, or even if you saw the cover, the movie's fairly slow, and the cover doesn't show, a big, nice little action scene or something super dramatic. It's usually was just their two faces. You might have passed this one up, and that's heartbreaking. If you're an adult now that have never heard about it, if you're a young person now that has never heard about it, this is a movie. And if you watched it when you were a kid and haven't watched it in 10, 20, potentially at this point, 30 years, go back and watch it. It's still as good now as it was then.
And just to slide in yet another reason to see it, the creature effects in the movie for the alien creatures are all practical puppetry effects. Because, of course, it's 1985. We do not have heavy CGI use. So it's all these practical little puppets for the creatures on this alien planet. And they look great, and they are surprisingly creepy and horrifying. From the little shelled creatures that scuttle around throughout the entire film, to the trapdoor predators that lure into these sand pits, to the alien creatures available for food to the Drac. It's a strange but compelling series of practical effects that make the film rewatchable in terms of, I just really want to sit and watch what they did with all of this terrain and these creatures for this alien environment to make it feel like a survivable but hostile planet.
So, last but not least, because the effects are right, the shooting is right, the editing is right, the acting is great, the script, the base work the script is on is brilliant, the script itself was brilliantly done. We're going to get into the last piece, which is the music, which is extremely important. The music was done by Maurice Jarre. Now, unless you're a film composer or really into film composition, you don't really pay that close attention to who does the music for the given things that you like. But in the case of Maurice Jarre's work, you have Fatal Attraction, you have Gorillas in the Mist,
Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago.
I'm gonna throw out this one here specifically for my wife. You have the movie Top Secret with Val Kilmer.
Grand Prix. He was one of those guys, and of course, Passage to India, Dreamscape, stuff like that. But importantly for this, he had just worked on the Mad Max series, and he ended up doing Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome as well. He worked on the Mad Max series, Jacob's Ladder, Dead Poet Society, School Ties, Prancer. Sunshine, if we're talking, films that people might be more familiar with, but this is someone who is a consummate studio composer.
Yeah,
and
builds a lot of atmosphere.
And he does a great job. And one of the most important things about that, in the film, a number of the soundtrack pieces are vocal choral songs in Drac. So we're talking the alien language that appears in the film done via song, and the song selection that they do in Drac is haunting as hymns. They're beautiful, strange alien music, as Alien is listening to something like Tuvan throat singing.
Yep. And what that brings to it is that next level intimate realism that makes the whole thing feel foreign, like it needs to feel, but then have you recognize that it only feels foreign. It feels foreign in a way that any film giving the perspective of a non-familiar culture would feel foreign. It feels complete and real and whole, even though most of the movie is set in one desolate planet spot.
Right, and there are brilliant contrivances they do in the film because, of course, as humans, we're viewing our exposure to Drac culture through the eyes of Davidge. Willis Davidge is learning from Jariba, or Jerry as he comes to call him, about Drac culture, Drac society, Drac philosophy, Drac beliefs. And that's a slow journey for him because he's just a jarhead pilot. He's not a warrior philosopher. He is a shooter. But Jerry is a warrior philosopher. And so they do you the favor of having Jerry pick up English very quickly. And so translation between cultural ideas happens on a much more teacher-student level than it might in another film. And it's wonderfully done that way because even though you're like, okay, well, like that happens a lot and that, you know, that oversimplifies it, it never allows it to come to the point where you feel like Jariba gets human society better than Davidge, and therefore there's no point in a cultural sharing of information. It's just that he picks up on the simple stuff much faster, but ultimately over time it shows that Davidge is the one who better understands the merging of the two cultures. It's a fantastic synthesis.
We've given a lot of reasons at this point to go see this movie, to pick it up on any number of streaming services, to rent it on a streaming service if you don't want to own it, to pick it up in a discount DVD bin, honestly, because it's there. Enemy Mine is a flawless little less than 2 hours science fiction film. I think it clocks in at just like 10 minutes shy of 2 hours. Less than 2 hours. It tells a nice, tight, functional story that spans time and shows growth. So it's not like a single night or a single weekend kind of tale, but it doesn't overextend itself. It doesn't overstay its welcome with any of its themes. It does allow all of the acting moments to land. And in a time where some of the movies I love are giant, complex special effects, 18 different location scenes, having a moment to breathe and relax and just watch something that relies on the drama and the writing to carry it, rather than big action pieces or big moments of special effects that were rendered by 1,000 computers.
As we record this, this obviously won't stay true forever, but I imagine this is going to stay true for some good time. It's available for free to watch if you've got DirecTV or if you have Cinemax or their Max Go product. I don't know how widely viewed the Cinemax app is, but I'm sure it's included in a lot of packages. But I know there's a lot of listeners out there who have DirecTV subscriptions, and it is one of their on-demand viewing films. And then, of course, for rentals, it's, $3 to $4 to rent this guy from all of the major, YouTube, Google Play, Fandango now. Everybody's got it because this is an over 30-year-old film, but at the same time, it's not gonna feel.
And so, give yourself the gift of watching this movie. Tell us what you think about the movie.
Yeah, if you do see it, chime in. Let us know what you thought of the film. And hey, for me especially, if you decide to go and read the story, Enemy Mine by Barry B. Longyear, please let me know, because of course I've read all of his series, The Enemy Papers, all of his Human Drac novels, and find them to be just stellar sci-fi.
Yes. So, get in the comments. Let us know what you think. This has been the first episode of Hidden Gems, Enemy Mine, with Jess and Steve, a Dying of Exposure series. Remember to like and subscribe to the YouTube, or sign up for notifications on the podcast, either through the website or however you listen to your podcast. And enjoy discovering these pieces that are almost at the point of being lost to the noise of how much media we have now. And maybe connect to something that framed the fandoms and interests of people before you.